The mediation room on the 14th floor of a downtown Columbus office tower smelled like burnt coffee and expensive paper. Richard Hartwell sat with his hands folded on the conference table, the way he always did when he wanted to look calm. Diane Hartwell sat beside him in a navy blazer she'd bought specifically for this meeting, as if the right blazer could change what the numbers on the screen in front of them were about to say. Across the table, their daughter Emily Hartwell opened a leather folder and slid a single printed page toward them, without a word. At the top of the page, in bold black type, was a number: $214,612. Beneath it, a decade of dates, transfers, and line items pulled directly from the trust their own father, Emily and her sister Chloe's grandfather, Walter Hartwell, had set up in 1998 to be split evenly between his two granddaughters when they came of age. Richard's jaw tightened. Diane's hand moved instinctively toward her husband's arm. Neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left to say. Every transfer on that page had their signatures on it. Every excuse they'd ever given Emily. "There's no money left, we had to help your sister, you're the responsible one, you don't need it the way she does," was sitting right there in black and white, dated, sourced, and notarized. 4 years earlier, these same two people had stood in an airport security line in Columbus, Ohio, boarding passes in hand, while their younger daughter walked down an aisle without them. 4 years earlier, they had chosen a gender reveal party 15 states away over their own daughter's wedding day. They believed, at the time, that the choice cost them nothing. They believed Emily would forgive them the way she always had. They were wrong, and it had taken 4 years, one forensic accountant, one very patient attorney, and a woman who had learned to stop begging for a seat at her own family's table, to prove exactly how wrong they were. Before we get into how we got here, tell me where you're watching this from tonight. Drop your city in the comments. And I want to know something else. Have you ever had to get even with someone who was supposed to love you? I want to hear about it. Rewind 4 years. Emily Hartwell was 29 years old, working as a project manager at a mid-sized logistics firm in Columbus, the kind of steady, unglamorous job that paid her rent and let her save a little every month if she was careful. She had grown up in the same city her whole life, in a modest brick colonial on Fairview Avenue that her parents had bought in 1994 and never left. She had 2 degrees, a bachelor's in business she'd financed almost entirely herself through a combination of scholarships, a work-study job in the registrar's office, and $31,000 in student loans she was still paying off, and a fiancé named Daniel Voss, an electrical engineer at a firm on the west side of town, who had proposed to her on a Tuesday, in their kitchen, because he said he didn't want to wait for some perfect moment that didn't need to be perfect to matter. Emily was, by every account from the people who knew her, the reliable one, the one who remembered your birthday, the one who drove 3 hours to help a college roommate move apartments, the one who, at family gatherings, ended up doing dishes while everyone else sat in the living room, because somebody had to, and it had simply always been her. Her younger sister, Chloe Hartwell, 2 years younger, married at the time to a man named Tyler Bregman and living in Scottsdale, Arizona, was, by every account from the same people, the golden one. Not through any particular cruelty on Chloe's part. Chloe had simply never had to fight for anything. When Chloe wanted to study fashion merchandising instead of finishing a nursing program she'd started and hated, their parents pulled together $46,000 over 2 years to cover the switch, the new tuition, and a semester abroad in Milan that Chloe described as life-changing. When Emily switched her own major sophomore year, from nursing to business, nobody paid for anything. She simply took out more loans. When Chloe got married, 3 years before Emily's wedding, Richard and Diane Hartwell had paid for nearly all of it. The venue, the dress, the catering, even the honeymoon in the Bahamas, a total that Emily would only learn much later, when it actually mattered, came to just under $61,000. At the time, Emily hadn't tracked the number. At the time, she'd simply smiled in her bridesmaid dress, given a toast about how happy she was for her sister, and told herself That was just how things were. Chloe needed more support. Chloe was more sensitive. Chloe had always struggled to find her footing, and Emily hadn't. That was the story the family told itself, over and over, until it became a kind of gravity nobody questioned. Emily didn't resent her sister, not really. Not in those early years. Chloe wasn't cruel. Chloe was simply a person who had never once had to ask twice for anything, and had therefore never developed the muscle for noticing when someone else had to ask at all. The pattern had roots that went back further than either sister's adulthood, and Emily could trace them, if she let herself, all the way to specific afternoons she still remembered with an uncomfortable clarity. When Emily turned 16, her parents gave her a bus pass and a job application to the grocery store 2 blocks from Fairview Avenue, and told her, not unkindly, that if she wanted a car for her senior year, she'd need to save toward one herself. She did. She worked 22 hours a week through her junior and senior years of high school, stocking shelves and running a register, and bought an 11-year-old Honda Civic with 94,000 miles on it for $3,200 in cash the summer before college. When Chloe turned 16, 2 years later, Richard and Diane bought her a 2-year-old Toyota Corolla outright, explaining to Emily, when she asked about the difference, that Chloe wasn't as mature as Emily had been at that age and needed the extra support to feel confident driving to school. Emily was 19 at the time, home from her first year of college, and she remembered standing in the driveway looking at her sister's new car and feeling something she didn't yet have language for. Not simple jealousy, but a colder recognition that the rules of her childhood and the rules of her sister's childhood had never actually been the same rules at all. There had been other moments like it, scattered across 2 decades, none of them individually large enough to justify the kind of anger Emily might have otherwise felt entitled to. The Christmas when Chloe received a laptop and Emily received a gift card to put toward one, since you're better at saving up. The summer Emily worked a full-time internship in Cleveland, unpaid, and drove herself 2.5 hours back and forth every weekend because nobody offered gas money, while Chloe spent that same summer on a family-funded trip to visit friends in California. The way Diane, at every family dinner for as long as Emily could remember, asked Chloe detailed, engaged questions about her day, her classes, her friendships, her feelings. While Emily's day was met with a polite, half-listening, "That's good, honey," before the conversation drifted back to Chloe. None of it, on its own, would have held up as evidence of anything in particular. All of it together formed a shape Emily had spent her whole life politely declining to look at directly, because looking at it directly meant admitting something about her parents she wasn't ready to admit. She had gone to Ohio State on the strength of a partial academic scholarship, a work-study position filing transcripts in the registrar's office 14 hours a week, and $31,000 in federal and private student loans she would still be paying down at 29, with a remaining balance of just under $19,000 the year she got married. Daniel, who she'd met her junior year in a shared statistics class neither of them particularly enjoyed, had come from a family with even less financial cushion than hers. His father drove a delivery truck for a regional grocery distributor, his mother worked reception at a dental office in Newark, Ohio, and Daniel had put himself through his engineering degree almost entirely on loans and a co-op program that paid him a modest stipend while he worked 3 semesters at a manufacturing plant outside Columbus. By the time they got engaged, both of them understood, without ever having to explain it to each other, exactly what it meant to build something from nothing, and exactly how little either of their families had cushioned that process. It was part of what drew them together in the first place, a shared, unspoken fluency in the particular exhaustion of being the responsible one. Emily's job at the logistics firm suited her, mostly. She managed scheduling and vendor relationships for a mid-sized freight brokerage on the north side of Columbus, the kind of role that rewarded exactly the qualities her family had spent her whole life relying on without paying for: patience, precision, the ability to hold a dozen moving pieces in her head at once and never let any of them drop. Her manager, a woman named Kathleen Ostrander, had told her more than once that Emily was the only person on the team she never had to double-check. Emily used to find a quiet, private pride in that. Later, once everything else came into focus, she would recognize it as one more version of the same arrangement, being trusted precisely because she never made anyone deal with the cost of trusting her. It was their parents who built the pattern, and their parents who, 4 years later, would be the ones sitting in a mediation room watching it collapse. Emily and Daniel got engaged in the spring and set a date for the following October, an outdoor ceremony at a converted barn venue 40 minutes outside Columbus, the kind of venue Emily had saved toward in a dedicated account for 2 years, contributing what she could out of every paycheck because she'd learned by then not to expect anyone else to cover it. The total cost of the wedding came to $28,400. Emily and Daniel paid for $24,900 of it themselves. Richard and Diane Hartwell contributed the remaining $3,500. Not because they couldn't afford more, Emily would later discover, but because that was what they decided Emily's wedding was worth, relative to everything else competing for their attention that year. What was competing for their attention was Chloe. In August, 2 months before Emily's wedding, Chloe called her parents to tell them she and Tyler were expecting their second child and that they wanted to throw a gender reveal party, a real one, with a photographer, a caterer, and a rented backyard tent, the same weekend as Emily's wedding, because it was the only weekend that worked around Tyler's work schedule and a run of good Arizona weather before the desert heat set back in. Diane Hartwell did not tell Emily about the conflict for 6 weeks. When she finally did, over the phone on a Sunday evening in early September, she framed it, from the very first sentence, as something that had already been decided. "Sweetheart, I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand there was no good option here," Diane said. "Chloe's doing the gender reveal the same weekend as your wedding. We already told her we'd be there. We didn't think it was fair to make her move it, not with the pregnancy and everything, and your dad already booked the flights." Emily sat very still on her side of the call, in the kitchen of the apartment she shared with Daniel, and said nothing for almost 10 full seconds. "You're not coming to my wedding," she said finally. "It wasn't a question. We'll see you the week before. We'll do a whole celebration. I promise you it won't feel like we missed anything," Diane said, already moving past it, already treating the matter as settled. "You understand, don't you? Chloe needs us there. This is a big moment for her." Emily's wedding was a big moment too. But that word, needs, was the same word Emily had been hearing about her sister since she was 7 years old, and somewhere underneath the calm in her voice, something in her finally, quietly, cracked. She didn't scream. She didn't cry on that call. Not where her mother could hear it. She said okay, in a voice that sounded steadier than she felt, and hung up, and sat at her kitchen table for a long time before Daniel came home and found her there in the dark. That was the moment the story really began, not the wedding day itself, but that phone call, 6 weeks before it, when Emily learned exactly how far down the list she ranked. The wrong deepened in the weeks that followed, in ways that were smaller individually and devastating cumulatively. 2 weeks before the wedding, Richard Hartwell called Emily, not to talk about the wedding, but to ask if she could help him out for a few months, with a short-term loan. Richard had started a small side business 2 years earlier, an online retail operation selling refurbished power tools, and he told Emily he needed $8,000 to cover a supplier order that had come in larger than expected. He promised to pay it back within 90 days, as soon as this shipment moves. Emily, who had just finished paying the final deposit on her venue and had almost nothing left in savings beyond her emergency fund, transferred him $6,000 from that emergency fund, money she and Daniel had built for exactly the kind of situation neither of them anticipated. Her own father asking to borrow from her, 3 weeks before he skipped her wedding. Richard never repaid it. Emily would learn, much later, through records her attorney would eventually subpoena as part of a much larger accounting, that $4,200 of that $6,000 went directly toward 2 round-trip plane tickets from Columbus to Phoenix, for himself and Diane, booked 9 days after Emily wired him the money, for travel on the exact weekend of Emily's wedding. Her father had borrowed money from her to buy the tickets that would take him away from her wedding. She didn't know that detail yet, on the day itself. On the day itself, she only knew the empty seats. 2 days before the wedding, at a rehearsal dinner held in a private room at an Italian restaurant on High Street, Richard and Diane called from a rental car in Arizona, where they'd already flown out early, to help Chloe get settled before the baby news. A trip that had simply expanded, week by week, to swallow the wedding weekend whole. 22 people sat around 2 long tables, silverware paused mid-air, listening to Diane's voice come tinny and cheerful through Emily's phone, propped against a water glass in the center of the table. "We are just so sorry we can't be there in person. Sweetheart, you know that," Diane said. "We're there in spirit. Every bit of it. You could still change your flights," Emily said, quietly enough that only the people closest to her heard it. "There's still time." There was a pause on the line, filled with the sound of a car engine, and faintly, Chloe's voice in the background asking Richard something about parking. "Honey, the flights are non-refundable at this point, and honestly, your sister needs us there for this. You have Daniel, you have all these people around you tonight. You'll be fine." Diane's voice softened into the gentle but final register she used whenever a decision had already been made, and she wanted Emily to stop pushing against it. "We love you. We'll see you soon." The call ended. Emily set her phone face down on the table, picked her fork back up, and finished her dinner, while Daniel's hand found hers under the tablecloth and held on, saying nothing, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make the moment worse. The wedding took place on a clear, cool Saturday in October. 206 guests, a string quartet during the ceremony, because Daniel's mother played violin and had insisted on live music. Emily walked down the aisle on the arm of her uncle, Richard's older brother, Gerald Hartwell, because her own father was 3,800 miles away in a backyard in Scottsdale, standing next to a table with pink and blue balloons, cutting into a cake that would reveal his 3rd grandchild's sex before he had watched his eldest daughter promise her life to someone. The ceremony itself went smoothly enough that most guests never noticed anything was wrong at all. Emily made sure of that, coaching the officiant and the wedding coordinator ahead of time to simply skip any reference to the bride's parents in the program and the remarks, so the absence would read, to anyone not already aware of it, as a simple choice rather than a wound. It was during the reception, seated at the head table with 2 place settings deliberately left empty rather than removed. A small, silent decision Emily had made weeks earlier, half out of some stubborn hope they'd change their minds, and half because she refused to pretend, even for the sake of appearances, that the chairs had never been meant for anyone. That the absence became impossible to ignore. During the toasts, there was a moment, captured unfortunately, on video by Daniel's cousin, who was recording the whole event on a tripod near the head table, where the maid of honor, Emily's college roommate Sarah Kessler, paused mid-toast, glanced toward the 2 empty chairs reserved at the family table, and said simply, "I know some people couldn't be here tonight, but Emily, everyone who is here loves you enough to fill this whole barn twice over." The room applauded. Somewhere near the back, Emily's Uncle Gerald raised his glass a little higher than necessary, a small, deliberate gesture that Emily caught and understood exactly for what it was. Emily smiled and did not cry, because she had promised herself she would not cry over this on her own wedding day, and she kept that promise, mostly. What broke that promise came 4 hours later, at 11:40 p.m., when Sarah, checking her phone in the coat check line, turned to Emily with an expression that made Emily's stomach drop before a single word was said. "Your mom posted," Sarah said, and turned the phone around. It was a photograph, Diane and Richard Hartwell, arms around Chloe and Tyler, standing in front of a pink and blue balloon arch under string lights, all four of them beaming. The caption read, "Best weekend ever with our girl and her growing family. Nothing beats being surrounded by the people who matter most. Hashtag family first. Hashtag baby number 2. The post was timestamped 9:52 p.m., while Emily was still in her wedding dress, 40 minutes into her first dance as a married woman, 3,800 miles away from the two people who had raised her. After what Richard and Diane Hartwell did to their own daughter that night, on a scale of 1 to 10, how angry are you right now? Drop your number, because it's about to get a whole lot more satisfying. Emily didn't confront her parents that night, or even that week. She let the wedding photos come back from the photographer. She sent thank you cards. She went back to work on Monday like nothing had happened, because that was what she had always done. Absorbed things, smiled through them, kept the peace, because keeping the peace had always been cheaper than the alternative. It was 3 weeks later, on a Thursday evening, that the breaking point actually arrived, and it arrived, fittingly, over something small. Emily had called her mother to ask, gently, whether they'd had a chance to look at the wedding photos she'd shared in a family album link. Diane answered distractedly, in the middle of what was clearly another conversation, and said, "Oh, sorry, honey, can I call you back? We're helping Chloe pick out paint colors for the nursery. It's a whole thing." In the background, Emily heard her father's voice, warm and easy, laughing about something with Tyler. The same warmth he had never once directed at her. In a call, in the 3 weeks since her own wedding. Emily hung up, sat down at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd sat in the dark the night her mother first told her they weren't coming, and, for the first time in 29 years, she asked herself a question she had never let herself fully ask before. What if this is never going to change? What if I keep waiting for them to notice, and they simply never do? She thought about the $6,000 her father still hadn't repaid. She thought about the $3,500 wedding contribution against the $61,000 they'd spent on Chloe's wedding 3 years earlier. She thought about 18 years of birthdays where Chloe's gifts were always slightly bigger, slightly more thoughtful, slightly more talked about at Thanksgiving. She thought about her grandfather, Walter Hartwell, who had died when she was 22, and the trust he'd set up specifically. She remembered this now, with a clarity she hadn't had reason to access in years, specifically so that the girls, as he always called them, would each have something of their own, something nobody could take from them or divide unevenly, because Walter Hartwell had apparently seen, even from the outside, the shape of what his son and daughter-in-law were capable of. Emily crossed a line in her own mind that night, not a loud one, no shouting, no dramatic phone call, no ultimatum, just a quiet, permanent decision that she was done asking to be chosen. Have you ever had that moment, where you stopped trying to be the bigger person and started paying attention instead? Tell me about it. She didn't know yet what she was going to do. She only knew she was done being surprised by it. The plan that followed took 4 years to build, and it began, almost accidentally, with a document. In November, a month after the wedding, Emily was helping her mother sort through boxes in the attic of the Fairview Avenue house, ostensibly to find old photo albums for a project Diane wanted to do. But really, because Emily had quietly decided she wanted to understand the shape of her family's finances before she decided what, if anything, to do about it. In one of the boxes, beneath a stack of old tax returns, she found a manila folder labeled, in her grandfather's handwriting, Girls Trust, 1998. Inside was a copy of the original trust document. Walter Hartwell had established it with $180,000 in seed funding, structured as an irrevocable trust for the equal benefit of his 2 granddaughters, to be held and invested until each turned 35, with Richard Hartwell named as sole trustee, subject to a fiduciary duty to manage the funds solely and exclusively for the equal benefit of both beneficiaries, with any distribution prior to age 35 requiring documented equal treatment between the beneficiaries absent extraordinary circumstances, approved in writing by both beneficiaries. Emily had known, vaguely, that a trust existed. Her grandfather had mentioned it once or twice when she was younger, in the offhand way older relatives mention things they assume you already understand. She had never seen the actual document. She had certainly never seen the phrase equal benefit spelled out in writing, with the force of a legal instrument behind it. She photographed every page of that document with her phone, replaced the folder exactly as she'd found it, and said nothing to her mother, who was 3 rooms away at the time, humming along to the radio while she sorted through a box of Christmas ornaments, entirely unaware that the daughter she'd raised to never make a fuss had just found the one document in the entire house capable of undoing everything. Emily didn't act on it immediately. She sat with it for nearly 6 weeks, rereading the photographed pages late at night after Daniel had gone to sleep, highlighting phrases on her laptop screen, cross-referencing the language against basic legal definitions she looked up herself: fiduciary duty, breach, accounting, beneficiary rights, building. In those quiet nighttime hours, a private vocabulary for a feeling she'd carried her whole life but had never had the words to properly name. She learned, from a State Bar Association explainer article, that a trustee who breaches fiduciary duty can be held personally liable to restore the trust to the position it would have occupied absent the breach. Language that struck her, reading it alone at her kitchen table at 11 at night, with a strange, cold clarity. There was a word for what had been happening to her. There was a legal word, with consequences attached to it, and nobody in her family had ever once mentioned it existed. Over the following months, Emily began, quietly and without telling anyone, to build a picture of where the trust's money had actually gone. She didn't do this out of financial desperation. She and Daniel were stable, if not wealthy. She did it because something in her had shifted, permanently, on that Thursday night at her kitchen table. She was no longer interested in waiting for her parents to notice her. She was interested in the truth. She started small. She requested her own account statements from the trust's custodian bank, National Heritage Trust Company, using her rights as a named beneficiary. A right she confirmed existed by reading, carefully, the Ohio Trust Code sections on beneficiary information rights, which she found through several hours of unglamorous, patient research using the Ohio Revised Code website and a handful of legal aid explainer articles. Ohio law, she learned, gave a beneficiary of an irrevocable trust the right to request an annual accounting from the trustee, a right her father, as trustee, had never once volunteered to honor, and a right Emily had never once thought to invoke, because nobody in her family had ever suggested she had it. Emily was building something here, quietly, without telling a single person in her family. Do you see where this is going yet? Drop your prediction in the comments before the plan unfolds. Her first written request for an accounting, sent by certified mail to her father in February, 16 months after the wedding, was polite, almost apologetic in tone. She simply asked, as a beneficiary, for a summary of the trust's current balance and transaction history. Richard responded 2 weeks later with a 2-paragraph email, vague and reassuring, saying the trust was doing fine and that there's nothing to worry about, everything's on track for when you both turn 35. No numbers, no documents, no accounting of any kind. That non-answer told Emily more than any spreadsheet could have. She had asked a simple, legally protected question, and her father, the trustee, obligated by both the trust document and Ohio law to answer it fully, had brushed her off exactly the way he'd brushed off every other request she'd made her entire life. Except this time, Emily wasn't going to let it go. She reached out, carefully and privately, to a forensic accountant named Priya Anand, whom she found through a friend from business school who had used Priya's firm during a contentious divorce. Priya specialized in tracing family trust and business fund flows, the kind of work that required patience, subpoena power eventually, and an ability to read years of bank statements for patterns nobody wanted found. Emily met with Priya in March in a small conference room at Priya's office in the Short North District of Columbus and laid out everything she knew: the trust document, her father's non-answer, the pattern of favoritism she'd lived inside her whole life, the $6,000 loan he'd never repaid, and her suspicion, nothing more than a suspicion at that point, that the trust's balance was far lower than it should have been. "If you're doing this to punish your parents, I'm not the right person to help you," she said. "But if you're doing this because you have a legal right to see how a trust meant equally for you and your sister has actually been managed, and you want to know the truth regardless of what it costs you emotionally, then yes, I can help, and we do this by the book, every step of the way, so that whatever we find is airtight." "What if there's nothing there?" Emily asked. "What if I'm wrong and it's just bad luck or bad investing and not what I think it is?" "Then you'll have your answer, and you'll have it honestly," Priya said. "That's worth something too. I've had clients come in here convinced of something ugly and walk out relieved to find out they were wrong. I've had others come in unsure and walk out with a case stronger than anything they expected. I can't tell you which one you are yet. Nobody can, until we look." Emily appreciated, more than she expected to, that Priya didn't promise her a villain from the very first meeting. It made everything that followed easier to trust, precisely because nobody had oversold it to her at the start. Emily chose the second path, and meant it. Over the following 18 months, working with Priya and, eventually, an estate and trust attorney named Marcus Delacroix, a soft-spoken, methodical man in his 50s, who had spent 30 years untangling exactly this kind of family financial knot, Emily built her case one document at a time. The work was slower and less cinematic than Emily had expected, and that, Priya told her early on, was exactly the point. "The families who lose these cases are the ones who move too fast," Priya said, during their second meeting, spreading a blank timeline across the conference table. "They confront before they document. We document first. Confrontation, if it happens at all, happens last, and only once there's nothing left for the other side to spin." So Emily learned to be patient in a way that was different from the patience she'd practiced her whole life. This wasn't the patience of waiting to be noticed. It was the patience of someone building a case brick by brick and refusing to let a single brick go in before it was tested. She spent 2 entire Saturdays going through every bank statement, tax return, and financial document she could find in her own records. Old joint accounts from childhood, a 529 plan her parents had technically opened in her name in 2003, but rarely funded, canceled checks she'd kept out of habit rather than any plan. Priya cross-referenced every scrap against the trust's known contribution history, building what she called a shadow ledger, an independent reconstruction of where the money should have gone, built entirely from Emily's side, so that whatever Richard eventually produced could be checked against a baseline he didn't know existed. Daniel, for his part, became Emily's second set of eyes on every letter Marcus drafted, reading through drafts at their kitchen table late at night, the same table where this whole thing had started, asking the questions a careful engineer asks: what happens if this assumption is wrong? What's the failure mode here? What does the worst version of this look like? And are we prepared for it? It was Daniel who first raised the possibility, early on, that Richard might simply refuse to respond at all, might let the matter drag in silence for years rather than produce a single document, and it was Marcus who reassured them both that silence, in this particular legal context, was not a strategy that actually protected a trustee. Ohio law didn't reward stalling, it penalized it. There were false starts. In April, 5 weeks after Emily's original written accounting request, Richard sent a second, longer email. 3 paragraphs this time, insisting that everything's accounted for. "I promise you your grandfather would be proud of how I've handled this." An email that Priya flagged immediately as containing no actual figures, dates, or supporting documentation of any kind, simply reassurance dressed up as an answer. Marcus advised Emily to respond once, in writing, restating the specific legal basis for her request, and giving Richard a final opportunity to comply voluntarily, before escalating, not because Marcus expected it to work, but because a clean, professional paper trail showing Emily's patience and good faith would matter enormously if the matter ever reached a judge. It didn't work. Richard didn't respond to the second letter at all. Emily was building something here, quietly, without telling a single person in her family. Do you see where this is going yet? Drop your prediction in the comments before the plan unfolds. Emily's work at the freight brokerage continued through all of it, largely undisturbed, because she made a deliberate choice early on to keep the two parts of her life entirely separate. Kathleen Ostrander, her manager, noticed only once, in the fall of that first year, that Emily seemed distracted during a vendor call. A rare enough occurrence that Kathleen asked about it afterward, gently, in the break room. Emily told her only that she was dealing with some family stuff, the same vague phrase most people use to end a conversation rather than start one. And Kathleen, respecting the boundary, didn't push. Emily would later think, looking back, that there was something almost funny about it, that she spent her days at work solving other people's logistics problems with total composure, tracing shipment delays and vendor disputes to their root causes with the same patient precision she was quietly applying, evenings and weekends, to her own family's finances, and that nobody at either end of her life ever saw both halves of her at once. There was also, throughout this stretch, a quieter and more private cost that no legal filing could capture. Emily went to 2 family dinners that spring, a birthday for Diane in April, an Easter gathering in early April the following year. Sitting across the table from her parents, with the full knowledge of what she was building against them, saying nothing, passing the mashed potatoes, listening to Diane talk about Chloe's nursery renovation, and feeling a strange, cold double consciousness she'd never experienced before. One version of her nodding along politely, another version cataloging, quietly, every new detail that might later matter. She told Daniel once, driving home from that Easter dinner, that she felt like a spy in her own family, and she hated it, and she wasn't going to stop. By early summer, Priya's shadow ledger and Emily's own beneficiary rights research had produced enough of a documented pattern. The vague responses, the missed deadlines, the historical anecdotes about unequal gifts that Emily had gathered, almost as an afterthought, from old family photos, birthday cards, and a handful of candid conversations with her Aunt Carol, Richard's sister, who had quietly confirmed several of the larger family gifts to Chloe over the years, without ever realizing how carefully Emily was listening, that Marcus felt confident moving to a formal legal demand. It was a threshold Emily crossed carefully, aware that once a certified letter with an attorney's letterhead arrived at her parents' house, there would be no pretending, on either side, that this was still a private family matter. The first real breakthrough came in June, 4 months into the process, when Marcus formally invoked Emily's beneficiary rights under Ohio Revised Code Section 5808.13, and sent Richard, as trustee, a certified demand letter requiring a full accounting of the trust's transactions going back to its inception in 1998, with a 30-day deadline and a clear statement that failure to comply could result in a petition to the probate court to compel an accounting and potentially remove him as trustee. Richard, panicked, called Emily directly the day he received it, his voice tight with an anger she had rarely heard from him. "What is this?" he said. "A lawyer? You're sending me a lawyer letter? I'm your father. You're also the trustee of a trust that legally belongs to me and Chloe equally," Emily said, her voice level, because she had rehearsed this exact call with Marcus 3 separate times before it happened. "I've asked you nicely once already. This isn't personal, Dad. It's a legal right I have, and I'm using it." Richard hung up on her. He did not, however, produce the accounting within 30 days, which, Marcus explained calmly, was itself useful information, because a trustee's failure to respond to a proper demand strengthened, rather than weakened, any eventual petition to the court. It took another 4 months, and one actual probate court filing, a petition to compel accounting, filed quietly in Franklin County Probate Court in October, exactly 2 years after Emily's wedding, before Richard finally produced records, under order of the court, through his own newly hired attorney, a real estate lawyer named Douglas Farr who, Marcus noted privately, had clearly never handled a trust accounting dispute before and had likely been chosen for comfort rather than competence. The production, when it finally arrived, was disorganized on purpose or by accident. 3 bankers' boxes of loose statements, receipts, and handwritten notes, spanning back to 2009, delivered to Marcus's office with no index and no summary, the kind of production a party makes when they're hoping the sheer volume will discourage anyone from actually reading it. Priya read all of it. She spent 6 weeks that winter, working evenings and weekends around her other clients, billing Emily carefully and transparently for every hour, building a master spreadsheet that cross-referenced every trust account statement against every personal account statement Richard had also been forced to produce under the court's order, tracing individual transfers by date, amount, and destination account number, flagging any transaction where money moved out of the trust and into Richard's personal accounts before moving out again to a third party. It was exactly the kind of unglamorous, line-by-line work that never appears in the version of a story people tell at parties, and it was also, Marcus told Emily more than once, the only kind of work that actually wins these cases. Juries and mediators don't believe feelings, he said. They believe spreadsheets. What that spreadsheet showed, once Priya finished tracing it line by line over the following winter, was worse than even Emily had privately suspected. Between 2010 and the present, Richard Hartwell, as trustee, had authorized 11 separate distributions from the trust that he characterized, in his own informal notes, as educational advances or family support, none of which had ever been disclosed to Emily, none of which had been split equally, and all of which had gone, in whole or overwhelming part, to Chloe. The largest single distribution, $34,000 in 2015, had funded Chloe's semester in Milan and the tuition difference from her switched major. A $61,000 series of withdrawals in 2018 had quietly covered the majority of Chloe's wedding, funneled through Richard's personal checking account so that it would appear, to anyone glancing at the trust statements, as an unrelated personal gift rather than a trust distribution. A maneuver Priya flagged immediately as a serious breach, since Ohio trust law required that any distribution be made directly and transparently to or for the named beneficiary, not laundered through the trustee's own accounts to obscure its source. A further $22,000, spread across 2019 and 2020, had gone toward a down payment assistance gift for Chloe and Tyler's first home in Scottsdale, and the $6,000 Emily herself had lent her father the month before her wedding, money that had nothing to do with the trust on paper, had, Priya discovered through subpoenaed bank records, been transferred by Richard, 4 days after he received it, into the same personal account he used to fund Chloe's expenses, effectively meaning Emily had unknowingly financed part of her own family's ongoing pattern of favoritism, on top of everything else. Total unequal distributions, principal plus a conservative estimate of lost investment growth, Emily should have earned on her equal half, $214,612. Emily received Priya's full report on a Tuesday afternoon in February, 3 years and 4 months after her wedding, sitting in Marcus Delacroix's office with Daniel beside her, holding her hand. She read through all 41 pages twice before she said a single word. "They told me there was no money for my wedding," she said finally, quietly. "They told me that to my face, and this whole time, they were pulling from something that was half mine." Marcus Delacroix had built his entire practice, over 3 decades, on exactly this kind of case. Not the dramatic, made-for-television will contests, but the quieter, more common tragedy of families where one child had been systematically favored over another through decades of financial decisions nobody ever wrote down as intentional. He kept a small, unremarkable office in a converted house near German Village, and he told Emily, during their very first consultation, that the hardest part of his job was never proving what had happened. The documents, once you found them, usually spoke plainly enough. The hardest part was watching a client absorb the confirmation of something they had suspected, quietly, for years, and had hoped, right up until the moment the proof arrived, that they were wrong about. "You're not going to feel triumphant when you see the final number," he told Emily gently, in that first meeting, months before Priya's report ever existed. "You're going to feel something closer to grief. I want you prepared for that, because most people aren't, and it catches them off guard." He was right. Marcus, who had seen this particular kind of grief in dozens of clients before her, didn't rush her. "You have 3 options from here," he said, once she was ready to hear them. "You can let this sit as private knowledge and simply protect your future share going forward. You can pursue a formal settlement, recovery of the misappropriated funds plus removal of your father as trustee, without ever going to open court. Or you can file suit and let a judge decide it, which is public, slower, and more expensive, but occasionally necessary if a trustee refuses to negotiate in good faith." Emily thought about it for 2 weeks. She thought about her parents, about the version of them she still, somewhere underneath all of this, loved. The version who had taught her to ride a bike on Fairview Avenue, who had shown up, at least, to her college graduation, who were not monsters, just people who had made 1,000 small choices to favor one daughter over another, until those choices calcified into something they probably didn't even see clearly themselves anymore. And she thought about the version of herself who had spent 29 years quietly absorbing the cost of those choices, and who was done doing that. She talked it through with Daniel on their back porch one night in early March, a glass of wine going warm in her hand, the numbers from Priya's report still sitting open on her laptop between them. "If I do this quietly, I get my money back and nothing else changes," she said. "If I sue them outright, it's public, it's ugly, and it might not even be faster. I don't want to destroy them, I just don't want to disappear anymore." Daniel didn't tell her what to do. He'd learned, over 4 years with her, that Emily rarely needed to be told anything. She needed room to say it out loud to someone who wouldn't flinch, and then she'd already know. What she said, eventually, sitting on that porch, was the closest thing to a mission statement the next 6 months would follow. "I want them to have to look at it. All of it, at once, in a room, where they can't change the subject to Chloe's nursery." She chose the middle path, a formal mediated settlement, with the threat of full litigation as the leverage behind it, timed, deliberately, strategically, on Marcus's careful advice, to coincide with a moment when her parents could least afford to stall. That moment arrived on its own, 6 months later, when Chloe and Tyler decided to buy a larger house in Scottsdale to accommodate their second child, and asked Richard and Diane for a $40,000 gift toward the down payment. A gift Richard intended to pull, once again from the trust, structured once again as a personal transfer through his own account to obscure its origin. Priya, who had maintained a discreet line of visibility into the trust's custodial account activity through Emily's ongoing beneficiary information rights, flagged the withdrawal request the same week it was submitted to National Heritage Trust Company. This was the moment Marcus had been waiting for. Rather than letting the withdrawal quietly process, he filed an emergency motion with the probate court to freeze further trust distributions pending the outcome of Emily's accounting petition, on the grounds of an ongoing, demonstrated pattern of breach of fiduciary duty. The court granted a temporary freeze within 8 days, and National Heritage Trust Company, bound by the order, declined to process the $40,000 withdrawal Richard had requested. Richard found out about the freeze the same way Diane found out about Emily's original petition 18 months earlier, not from Emily directly, but from a letter. He called Emily that same evening, and for the first time since this whole process began, his voice on the phone wasn't angry, it was something closer to frightened. "Emily, please," he said. "Whatever this is about, we can talk about it. Your sister needs this house. The kids need space. Please don't do this to her, over something between you and me." "It was never just between you and me," Emily said. "That's the whole problem, Dad. It never was." He didn't have an answer for that. Marcus's office scheduled the mediation for 3 weeks later, giving Richard's newly retained attorney enough time to review the full accounting Priya had compiled, and, presumably, enough time to explain to Richard exactly how little room he had left to maneuver. Was Emily justified in what she did next, or did she go too far, freezing her own father's ability to help her sister, over money that was, on paper, decades old? Give me your verdict, because it's about to land either way. The night before the mediation, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay awake next to Daniel, staring at the ceiling of the same apartment bedroom they'd shared since before the wedding, running through Priya's exhibits in her head one more time, not because she'd forgotten any of them, she could have recited the dates and dollar amounts in her sleep by that point, but because some part of her still couldn't quite believe the 4 years had actually arrived at an ending. Around 1 a.m, Daniel rolled over and said, without opening his eyes, "You've read it enough times. You know it cold. Let yourself sleep." She didn't. Not really. But she appreciated that he knew better than to promise her it would be easy. She dressed the next morning in a gray blazer she'd bought specifically for the occasion, the same deliberate choice Diane would later make with her own navy one, though neither woman knew that about the other at the time. Marcus met Emily and Daniel in the lobby of the office tower 40 minutes early, going over the sequence of exhibits one final time, reminding her, as he had reminded her at least a dozen times over the preceding weeks, that her job in that room was simply to let the documents speak, and to resist, no matter what her father said, the urge to argue with him directly. "The numbers will do more damage than any sentence you could say," Marcus told her, in the elevator on the way up. Let them. The mediation was scheduled for that Thursday in March, in a conference room on the 14th floor of a downtown Columbus office tower. The same room described at the very start of this story. Present were Richard and Diane Hartwell and their attorney, Emily, Daniel, Marcus Delacroix, and Priya Anand, and, at Richard's insistence, Chloe and Tyler, who Richard believed would help put things in perspective for Emily, and who instead sat through the entire 2.5-hour session in a silence that grew heavier with every document Priya put on the screen. Priya walked through it methodically, in the same calm, unhurried voice she'd used with Emily 18 months earlier. The 2015 Milan transfer, the 2018 wedding funds, laundered through Richard's personal account, the 2019 and 2020 down payment gifts, the $6,000 loan from Emily herself, quietly redirected. Line by line, date by date, dollar by dollar, until the number on the printed page, $214,612, stopped being an abstraction and became, in front of everyone in that room, an undeniable, documented fact. Diane cried. Richard, for the first time in Emily's entire adult life, did not have an answer ready. He tried, twice, to interject with context. "That was during a hard year for Chloe, you have to understand." And later, weaker, "We always meant to make it up to you eventually." And both times Priya simply continued through the next line item, calm and unbothered, letting the numbers do the work no explanation could undo. Chloe, staring at the 2018 wedding transfer line item in particular, turned to her parents with an expression Emily had genuinely never seen on her sister's face before. Not the golden confidence Emily had watched Chloe wear her entire life, but something closer to shame, and beneath the shame, a dawning understanding that the family story she had also been told, "Emily's the responsible one, she doesn't need help the way you do," had been, this whole time, a story constructed partly to justify exactly this. "Mom," Chloe said quietly, at one point, staring at the screen rather than at either parent, "you told me Emily didn't want a big wedding. You told me that's why hers was smaller." Nobody answered her. Diane looked down at her hands. It was, in its own way, the moment Emily had spent 4 years quietly building toward, not the number on the page, which she had known for months by then, but this exact second, when the story her family had told itself finally had to compete, out loud, in front of everyone who'd ever repeated it, with the truth. "You told me there was nothing left when I got married," Emily said, and her voice, for the only time in the entire mediation, shook slightly. "You told me that, to my face, 3 weeks before I walked down the aisle without you." Richard's attorney, recognizing the position his client was in, moved quickly toward settlement, rather than risk a public trial that would put every one of these transactions, plus Richard's evasive email and his failure to respond to Marcus's original demand letter, into the public court record. Within that same afternoon, terms were reached. Richard would restore $214,612 to the trust corpus, funded through a combination of liquidating a retirement account and taking a home equity line against the Fairview Avenue house. Richard would be removed as sole trustee and replaced with National Heritage Trust Company, acting as independent corporate trustee going forward. And any future distributions would require documented, equal treatment between both beneficiaries, exactly as Walter Hartwell had specified in 1998, enforced now not by trust in a family member, but by a corporate fiduciary bound by law. The restoration was not simple, and Marcus made sure Emily understood, from the day the settlement was signed, exactly how each dollar would come back. Richard liquidated a portion of his own 401k, incurring an early withdrawal penalty he had no way to avoid, contributing $91,000 toward the restoration. The remaining balance was covered through a home equity line of credit against the Fairview Avenue house, the same house Emily had grown up in, the same driveway where she'd once stood at 19 years old looking at her sister's new car. National Heritage Trust Company, now acting as sole independent trustee under the amended trust terms, verified each incoming payment against the court-approved restoration schedule and confirmed, in writing, once the full $214,612 had been restored to the corpus. The restoration was completed within 4 months. Emily's equal share of the trust, including the restored funds, prior growth, and her portion going forward, came out to just over $187,000 once fully corrected and reallocated, money that, at 33 years old, she and Daniel used to pay off the remainder of her student loans, put a meaningful down payment on a house of their own in the Clintonville neighborhood of Columbus, and set aside a college fund for the daughter they welcomed 8 months after the mediation concluded. The house on Sherwood Road wasn't large. 3 bedrooms, a small backyard with an old maple tree the previous owners had left standing, a kitchen Emily gutted and rebuilt herself over a series of weekends with Daniel's help. But it was the first thing either of them had ever owned outright, without a single dollar of anyone else's money holding it up. And Emily found herself, in the months after they moved in, standing in that kitchen some evenings just looking around at it, feeling something settle in her chest that she didn't fully have words for until Daniel, watching her one night, said it for her. "You built this one yourself. Nobody gets to tell you a different story about it." Richard and Diane Hartwell did not lose everything. They kept their home, though it now carried a lien against it. They kept their marriage, though Diane would later admit to Emily, in a rare, unguarded moment nearly a year afterward, that the mediation had been the first time in decades she'd truly had to look at what she and Richard had built their family's peace on top of. What they lost was simpler and, in some ways, more permanent. The story they had told themselves about who they were as parents, and the assumption, one they had apparently never questioned in 29 years, that Emily would always, eventually, forgive whatever they did, quietly, without cost. Chloe reached out to Emily on her own, 3 weeks after the mediation, without their parents' knowledge. She didn't call to defend Richard and Diane. She called to say she hadn't known, genuinely hadn't known, how much of what she'd received over the years had come at Emily's expense, and that she was ashamed of how easily she'd accepted the story that she simply needed more help than her sister did. It wasn't a full reconciliation. It was, Emily would later say, a beginning, the first honest conversation the two sisters had had in years, built not on old assumptions, but on a shared, uncomfortable truth they'd finally both had to look at directly. "I always thought you didn't need anything from them," Chloe admitted on that call, her voice small in a way Emily had genuinely never heard from her before. "Like it just came easy to you. I never once thought about whether that was actually true, or whether it just made it easier for everyone if I believed it. It was never true, Emily said. I just never made it your problem. The two sisters didn't fix everything on that call, and they both knew it. But over the following 2 years, something between them slowly, carefully rebuilt. Not the closeness of childhood, which had always been slightly lopsided to begin with, but something steadier, built on fewer assumptions. Chloe began asking Emily real questions at family gatherings, about her job, about Daniel, about the daughter Emily and Daniel welcomed the following spring, and for the first time in either of their lives, it didn't feel like an accident that she was asking. There was a moment, at Grace's first birthday party, held in the backyard of the Sherwood Road house, when Chloe pulled Emily aside near the drink table and said, quietly, "I know I can't undo any of it. I just want you to know, I see it now. All of it. I should have seen it a long time before I did." Emily didn't need the apology to feel complete to accept it. She hugged her sister, briefly, in the way two people hug when they're both still learning the actual shape of each other, and went back to the party, and didn't bring it up again. Not because it didn't matter, but because some things, once said honestly, don't need repeating to stay true. Richard and Diane's relationship with Emily took longer to find any kind of footing and never fully returned to what it had been before, which Emily eventually decided was not a loss so much as an honest correction. There was a birthday dinner, roughly a year after the mediation, where Richard, halfway through the meal, set down his fork and said, without being asked, "I've thought about it every single day since that room. I don't have a good excuse. I just always assumed you'd forgive it, the way you always had, and I never once asked myself whether that was fair to keep assuming." Emily didn't tell him it was fine. She didn't tell him it wasn't. She simply said, "Thank you for saying that," and let the rest sit exactly where it was, because some sentences don't need a response to matter. Emily and her parents still speak, occasionally, 4 years after that mediation. Birthdays, holidays, brief and careful conversations that carry a formality that wasn't there before, and that Emily has decided she's at peace with. Because formality, at least, is honest. She stopped waiting for them to notice her the way they'd always noticed Chloe. She built, instead, a life that didn't depend on that noticing at all. A marriage, a home, a daughter, a career she'd earned entirely on her own terms. And she did it not through anger, not through a single loud confrontation, but through 4 patient years of asking exactly the right questions, in exactly the right order, until the truth had nowhere left to hide. Richard Hartwell still keeps a folder in his home office, a habit he picked up after the mediation. Copies of every trust statement, every distribution, filed and organized and available for review at any time, to anyone who asks. Nobody in the family has ever needed to ask him for it since. He makes sure of that now. It's the kind of change that only ever comes after the version of yourself that didn't bother has already cost you something you can't get back. Emily's daughter, Grace, is 2 years old now, and on the afternoons when Diane comes to visit, carefully, on Emily's terms, always calling first, never simply arriving the way she used to at Chloe's, Emily watches her mother sit on the living room floor building block towers with a granddaughter who has no idea yet what any of this cost to arrive at, and she feels something complicated that she's stopped trying to simplify into a single emotion. Not forgiveness, exactly. Not resentment either, not anymore. Something more like clarity, the plain, settled knowledge of exactly what her parents are capable of, and exactly what they're not, held alongside the fact that she loves them anyway, in the smaller, more honest shape that love has taken since that room on the 14th floor. She thinks, sometimes, about the version of herself who sat in that Italian restaurant 2 days before her wedding, holding a phone against a water glass, listening to her mother explain from a rental car in Arizona why she wouldn't be there. That version of Emily believed, in some quiet, unexamined part of herself, that the right amount of patience, or the right amount of good behavior, would eventually earn her an equal seat at the table. It took 4 years and $214,612 to teach her the actual lesson underneath that belief, that some seats aren't earned through patience at all. They're claimed, deliberately, once you finally understand you were entitled to them the whole time. Emily doesn't think of what she did as revenge. Not exactly. Not the way people usually mean the word. She thinks of it as the moment she finally stopped auditing herself for whether she deserved to be treated equally, and started auditing the people who owed her that answer instead. It took 4 years. It took a forensic accountant, an estate attorney, a probate court filing, and a great deal of quiet, patient, unglamorous work that nobody watching from the outside would have called dramatic, right up until the moment it was. Priya Anand still sends Emily a card every October, around the anniversary of the wedding, with the same handwritten line every year. Some plans take years. Yours was worth every one of them. Marcus Delacroix retired 18 months after the settlement closed, and at his retirement dinner, when a junior associate asked him to name the case he was proudest of across 30 years of practice, he named Emily's without hesitation. Not because of the dollar figure, he said, but because of how long she was willing to wait, and how carefully, to get the truth instead of just the money. Emily still keeps the original manila folder, or rather a photograph of it, saved in a locked file on her laptop labeled simply 1998, a private reminder of the exact moment the story changed direction, back in an attic she hadn't visited more than a handful of times since. She doesn't need to look at it often anymore. But she knows it's there, the same way she knows now, in a way she didn't at 29, that the right to be treated equally was never something she had to earn in the first place. It was always hers. It simply took her 4 patient, deliberate years to make everyone else in her family finally admit it. Daniel likes to say, when people at dinner parties ask how he and Emily met, that he fell in love with a woman who could hold 12 moving pieces in her head at once and never let a single one drop. And that it took him years to understand that the same quality that made her so good at her job, so reliable to everyone around her, was also the quality her own family had quietly relied on for 3 decades without ever once thanking her for it. He says it lightly, usually, at the end of a story that's mostly about the wedding, mostly about the Facebook post, mostly about the number on the page in that conference room. But there's a version of it, the version he only tells Emily, late at night, that isn't light at all, the version where he simply says he's proud of her and means every word of it. There is a version of this story where Emily simply let it go, where she absorbed one more slight the way she'd absorbed hundreds before it, smiled through another holiday, and told herself, one more time, that this was simply how her family worked and always would. That version of the story was available to her every single day for 4 years. She could have taken it at any point, after the wedding, after the rehearsal dinner call, after the Facebook post at 9:52 p.m., after her father hung up the phone on her. Nobody would have blamed her for choosing it. It was, after all, the choice she'd made her entire life up to that point. She didn't choose it. And the difference between the daughter who spent 29 years quietly keeping the peace and the woman who sat calmly in a conference room 4 years later, watching her own father run out of excuses for the first time in his life, wasn't anger. It was patience finally aimed somewhere other than at herself. If you've ever had to prove your own worth to the people who were supposed to already know it, or if you've ever finally stopped trying, tell me about it in the comments below. And if this story kept you until the very end, you know exactly where to find the next one. Subscribe to the Revenge Vault, because some of the best plans take years to pay off, and we've only just gotten started.